I have known Callum Bover since we were boys of 7, racing ponies across the high moor above Duncraig Hall with the wind screaming in our ears, and not a care between us for titles or duty or the great grinding machinery of the aristocracy. I have stood beside him in 3 parliamentary battles, 2 duels that never quite escalated to the actual dueling part, and 1 spectacular incident involving a prize bull and the Countess of Harfield's rose garden, the details of which I shall carry to my grave. I have seen him unmoved by flattery, unimpressed by rank, and utterly indifferent to the parade of heiresses that the London marriage market sent north each season like sacrificial offerings to a Highland god. I say all this so that you understand the weight of what I am about to tell you. I was there the night he married Cressida Marne. I was there the morning after, when I found him in the library before the fire had been lit, still in his evening clothes, turning a single silver bracelet in his fingers with an expression I had never once seen on his face in 30 years of close acquaintance. And I was there 6 months later in that same library, when he looked up from a letter and said, quietly, without the slightest dramatics, without any of the performance that men of his rank consider their birthright, "I believe I have loved her from the very first hour, Fenwick. I only required 6 months to admit it. I have carried the whole of it since then. What follows is the true account, not the version that circulated in London, which involved a romantic ambush at a Highland waterfall and a white horse, neither of which appeared anywhere in the actual proceedings. The truth is simultaneously less theatrical and more extraordinary, as the truth so often is. It begins with a debt. Not Callum's debt. Callum had never owed a man anything in his life, and took considerable pains to keep that record intact. The debt belonged to Gerald Marne, formerly of Marne Park in Dorset, latterly of a set of cramped rooms in Bath that bore very little resemblance to his former dignity. Gerald Marne had possessed, in his prime, 3 things of value: a decent estate, a tolerable cellar, and a daughter of uncommon intelligence and entirely inconvenient opinions. He had mismanaged the first, drunk through the second, and entirely failed to capitalize on the third before the whole enterprise collapsed around him. The man responsible for the collapse was a creditor named Silas Varne, and I use the word responsible with precision, because what Varne had done went rather beyond the ordinary ruthlessness of money lending. Varne had been Gerald Marne's friend first. He had dined at Marne Park, hunted Marne's coverts, borrowed Marne's books, attended Gerald's birthday celebrations, and been trusted with the particular comfortable intimacy of a man welcomed into a family. Over the course of several carefully arranged years, he had maneuvered Gerald into a series of loans whose terms shifted whenever Gerald wasn't looking, whose interest compounded in ways that defied the original agreements, and whose final accounting bore no resemblance to anything Gerald had signed. He exploited trust in the most systematic way, slowly, patiently, in increments small enough that each one seemed an oversight or a misunderstanding, until the aggregate became an ambush. By the time Gerald realized what had happened, Marne Park had been sold to satisfy the debt. Gerald had been installed in Bath with an allowance that kept him alive but barely, and Silas Varne had acquired a rather fine property in Dorset at a price that would not have satisfied a magistrate's scrutiny, and which he had since let out to a tenant family at a rent that was paying him handsomely. Gerald Marne's daughter, Cressida, was 20 when this happened, and she had 2 qualities that distinguished the genuinely formidable from the merely clever. The first was that she understood everything, the mechanism of what Varne had done, the precise moment when each manipulation had been inserted, the legal instruments that had been twisted and the ones that had simply been ignored without consequence because no one with the means to enforce them had been watching. She had read every document. She had spent 3 weeks going through them all, the original loan agreements, the amendments, the settlement instruments, the final accounting. She had written to 2 solicitors. She had been told, politely and with varying degrees of condescension, that the matter was settled, and that young women of her station ought to direct their considerable energies toward securing a suitable husband rather than pursuing legal chimeras. The second quality was that she did not accept things merely because they had been declared settled by people with more power than she possessed. She was still fighting, writing letters, tracking Varne's movements through the legal proceedings she found in public records, corresponding with a cousin in the legal profession who had slightly more appetite for the case than the Bath solicitors, but considerably less resource than the task required, when the matter of the marriage arose. I was present for that conversation too, though I should not have been. Callum had invited me to Duncraig for the shooting, and I had arrived a day early to find him in the library with Dunbar, the Edinburgh solicitor, a lean man of methodical habit and an excellent memory for legal instruments, and a letter spread across the desk that Callum was reading with the expression he normally reserved for parliamentary bills he found offensive. I made to withdraw. Callum waved me back with a short gesture. He had no patience for ceremony even in private moments, which was one of the reasons I had always liked him. The other reason was that he was honest, which is rarer in men of his position than it ought to be. He told me the situation plainly, as he always did. His mother's will had come to light, or rather, a codicil to his mother's will, drafted 3 years before her death and apparently misfiled by a solicitor now deceased. The codicil stipulated that the Duncraig estate, which passed to Callum without complication, carried a condition regarding a particular parcel of land in the North Valley. The old Gaelic holdings that his mother had cared about most, the land that had been in the family for 3 centuries, and which she had loved with the particular fierceness of someone who knew what belonging to a place actually meant. The condition was that this parcel could only pass to Callum's direct heir. If Callum died without a legitimate child, the North Valley holdings reverted not to the estate at large but to a distant branch of the family, the Bover cousins in Edinburgh, men Callum described, economically and accurately, as wolves in bad coats. I had met 2 of them once at a parliamentary reception and found them to be exactly as advertised. Men who wore the performance of civility like a coat that doesn't quite fit and spend their social interactions looking around the wearer's shoulder for something more profitable. "I require a wife," Callum said, with approximately the same inflection a man might use to say he required a new pair of boots. "I have been advised to attend to it before the next session, as there is apparently a legal challenge being assembled by the cousin's solicitor, who seems to believe that the codicil may not be enforceable, and I would prefer to render the question moot before it becomes a parliamentary embarrassment." "You could marry for love," I offered in the spirit of honest contribution. He looked at me as though I had suggested he attend the season wearing a court jester's hat. There was a pause of the particular quality that means he is deciding whether to treat the remark as the joke it partly was, or the genuine observation it partly also was. "I could marry efficiently," he said, "which is what I intend to do." Callum's version of marrying efficiently was characteristically methodical. He had no interest in the London season and its attendant performance, the balls, the calls, the elaborate dances of introduction and assessment and strategic positioning that consumed the spring months of the English aristocracy. He had no interest in a society beauty who would be miserable in the Highlands and make everyone around her miserable in turn. He wanted a woman of some intelligence, sufficient practicality to manage a great house, and what he called, and I am quoting precisely, the good sense not to require constant entertainment. He also, though he would not have said so himself, wanted someone who would not be frightened of him, which was a rarer quality than it sounds. Callum at 37 was an imposing figure, tall, dark, broad-shouldered, with a bluntness of manner that the London drawing rooms had decided long ago to classify as terrifying rather than take the trouble to understand, and with the kind of face that expresses nothing unless he chooses to express it, which he rarely does. Women who encountered him at political gatherings tended to find him alarming. Women who were produced for him during the single season he had submitted to in his 30s had found him alarming and dull simultaneously, which is a difficult combination to achieve and which he had managed without trying. He did not charm. He did not flatter. He engaged seriously with people who engaged seriously with him, and he removed himself from people who did not, with a directness that left them unsure whether they had been dismissed or simply not noticed. He was, in short, a man whose qualities required proximity and patience to discover. Most people never got close enough, and most people had long since decided this was his failing rather than theirs, which was the kind of convenient conclusion that requires no particular effort and produces no particular result. I had gotten close enough over 30 years by the simple mechanism of refusing to treat his self-containment as a rejection and his directness as an insult. He was not an easy man to know in the social sense. He was, I had found, a very easy man to trust. The two are not the same thing and are more often opposed than not, and I have always valued the second considerably above the first. It was Dunbar who found the Marne name. Cressida Marne had come to Dunbar's attention not through the usual channels, but because she had sent him a letter, unsolicited, precise, and rather remarkable, outlining the legal irregularities in Silas Varne's acquisition of Marne Park and requesting his professional assessment of whether a case could be made. She had found his name through her cousin's recommendation. She had written the letter in her own hand, without assistance, with the exact citation of every relevant document and the specific identification of 3 clauses she believed had been altered between the original signing and the executed instruments. Dunbar, whose professional life was largely occupied with the routine transactions of Edinburgh's merchant class, and who had more appetite for unusual problems than most of his profession, had kept the letter. It had struck him as the work of a genuinely able mind operating without any of the resources that enable such minds to be useful, which he found somewhat poignant and considerably interesting. When Callum described his requirements, Dunbar produced it. "Her father is ruined," Dunbar said. "The girl is educated, rather more than is fashionable. She speaks 3 languages, manages accounts, and has been conducting her own legal investigation of the man who ruined her family for 3 years. She is 23, unmarried, and in want of a situation. Her circumstances make her available. Her character makes her worth your consideration." Callum read Cressida's letter. He read it slowly, which was unusual for him. He typically reads everything rapidly and retains it entirely, which has occasionally unnerved committee members who assumed he hadn't been paying attention. Then he handed it back to Dunbar and said, "Arrange a meeting." I did not attend the meeting. I had returned to Edinburgh by then, and what I know of it comes from Callum's subsequent account, which was brief and entirely factual in the way he is always factual, and from Cressida's account, which I heard much later and which was considerably more detailed and occasionally quite amusing in the way that accounts of large moments are when enough time has passed for the person telling them to see the absurdity alongside the significance. They met in Dunbar's offices, which were on the 2nd floor of a solid Edinburgh building and had the quality of a room that has been occupied by careful thought for many decades. Callum arrived early, which he always does. Cressida arrived on time, which he later said he had noted with approval. He had expected to find a young woman in reduced circumstances, which generally means a particular quality of quiet resignation, a kind of careful diminishment of expectation that poverty imposes on people who were not born to it. He did not find that. He found a young woman of middling height, dressed neatly in clothes that had been carefully maintained and were several seasons old, with dark hair arranged practically rather than fashionably, in a style that gave the impression of someone who has made their peace with their hair and decided not to waste further energy on it. She had a pair of gray eyes that surveyed him with an attention that he later described as not unlike being catalogued by someone who intends to be thorough. She had also, he noticed, assessed the room before she sat down, the desk arrangement, the document case, the position of Dunbar's chair relative to his own, with the quick economy of someone accustomed to understanding situations from their physical elements. He had not expected that. He told her the situation directly, because he saw no value in approaching it otherwise, and because he had a reasonable suspicion that she would see through approach of any indirect variety in any case. The codicil, the cousins, the North Valley holdings, the nature of what he required. The terms he was proposing, his protection, his name, the restoration of her father to a dignified situation, financial security for the rest of her life. In exchange, he required a legitimate heir, the management of Duncraig Hall, and no interference in his political affairs, which were his primary occupation and which he had no intention of adjusting. He had offered it plainly and waited for her response. She thanked him clearly, without excessive warmth or the breathless gratitude that women in reduced circumstances were expected to perform when offered rescue from them. And then she had asked him, in a tone that he would later describe as entirely level, not challenging but genuinely inquiring, whether, in the event she agreed to this arrangement, he would be willing to review the documentation she had assembled regarding Silas Varne's acquisition of Marne Park. He had not been expecting that question. In all his imagined variations of this meeting, not one of them had included a practical legal inquiry in the middle of what was essentially a proposal. He had expected gratitude, or calculation, or careful enthusiasm. He had not expected her to be already managing several ongoing priorities, one of which she was now, quite calmly, attempting to attach to this one. She looked at me, he told me afterward, sitting across the fire with the whiskey in his hand and a quality of careful honesty in his voice that I had not heard before, as though the answer to that question were more important to her than any of the rest of it. She did not seem indifferent to the rest. But she had been carrying this matter for 3 years, and it was the thing she needed most. He said yes. He was curious, which was not a state he entered into lightly, and which, once entered, he pursued with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. She said she would think about the arrangement and send him her answer within the week. He rode back to Duncraig that evening through the spring Edinburgh light and spent, according to Mrs. Ichterberg, who was not one to overlook significant departures from his usual routine, an uncharacteristic hour standing on the north parapet looking at the valley before going to bed. She sent her answer in 4 days. The letter was 3 sentences. She would accept the arrangement. She had 3 conditions. Her father was to be settled in comfort before the wedding. Her correspondence regarding the Varn matter was to be treated as private and shared at her discretion, and she would require a room of her own with adequate light for reading and for work. She would expect the same practicality from him that she was offering, and she expected him to keep his word as she intended to keep hers. Callum showed me the letter when I came back to Duncraig for the wedding preparations. He did not comment on it, but he had kept it in the inner pocket of his coat, which was where I knew him to keep things that mattered, and where I had never previously seen him keep a letter from a woman. I noticed that I said nothing. The wedding was at the kirk in Duncraig village, and it was as efficient as its architect had intended. No elaborate festivities, no procession of carriages, no London contingent invited north to marvel at the scenery and report back to their clubs on the Duke of Duncraig's peculiar matrimonial choices. Gerald Marne came, looking somewhat bewildered by the elevation in his circumstances from the bath rooms to the guest suite at Duncraig Hall, which were about as different as 2 rooms can be while technically both having roofs. Dunbar came, with his professional composure and the particular satisfaction of a man whose instincts have been borne out. I came. Mrs. Ichterberg, who had been Duncraig's housekeeper for 22 years, and who regarded every event as an opportunity for quiet assessment of how it compared to previous events in the household's history, stood near the door of the kirk with her hands folded and assessed. Cressida Marne married Callum Bover on a Thursday morning in September with clear eyes and a straight back, and what I can only describe as a kind of contained composure, not coldness, not nerves, but the manner of someone who has made a decision they have thought through thoroughly and intends to see it through without drama. She wore a gown of pale gray silk, because she was not going to pretend this was a love match, and she wore the Duncraig pearls that Mrs. Ichterberg had brought from the vault that morning, with the air of a woman executing an important professional duty, because Cressida was not going to be careless about the dignity of the occasion either. She had borrowed one of Mrs. Ichterberg's hairpins, and she thanked her for it with a directness and warmth that Mrs. Ichterberg told me afterward was the moment she decided the new Duchess would do very well. Callum, for his part, had dressed better than I had ever seen him for a non-parliamentary occasion, in the dark Bover tartan sash and his best Edinburgh coat, which I privately considered significant and said nothing about because I am, occasionally, capable of that. They were composed with each other, correct and almost formal in the way of 2 people who have agreed on terms and are honoring the formality of the occasion without performing feelings they have not yet developed. When he took her hand at the altar, his expression was the careful neutral of a man who is paying attention to something and not yet sure what it means. When she said her vows, she said them clearly, in the same level tone she used for everything, without sentiment and without coldness, simply said them because she had agreed to them and meant what she agreed to. I watched them because I have always watched Callum, and I saw the moment brief, almost nothing, a fraction of a second during the exchange of the ring when his attention shifted from the ceremony to her face. He was looking at her and she was looking at the vicar, and she was entirely, genuinely calm, and something in that composure caught him. Not her beauty, Cressida was not conventionally beautiful, though she was not plain either. She had a quality of aliveness in her face that was more interesting than beauty and more difficult to define, something that lived in the attention of her gray eyes and the mobility of her expression when something genuinely engaged her. But her composure, her absolute absence of performance. He looked away again quickly, but he had looked, and the looking had a quality of beginning. I was the last to leave the great hall that evening, engaged in a rather spirited conversation with Gerald Marne about the comparative merits of Bath's various walks, which were apparently Gerald's primary form of exercise, and about which he had developed strong opinions during his months of residence. By the time I realized that the hall had emptied and the fire had burned low, there was no sign of the new Duke and Duchess of Duncraig anywhere in the public rooms. I found my guest chamber. I went asleep, and that, as far as my direct observation is concerned, is where the first night of their marriage ceases to be my story to tell, except for what Callum told me himself, later in the library, with the silver bracelet still in his fingers. He told it the way he told everything, factually in order, without embellishment, with the precise attention to detail that marks the account of someone who has been turning something over in his mind for a long time and has finally found occasion to set it out in full. Which is how I know every detail is true. They had been in the drawing room after the other guests retired, on opposite sides of a fire that Mrs. Ichterberg had built up with the particular conscientious abundance of a woman who has been preparing this house for events for 22 years and knows that warmth is the one thing she can always provide. The room was large and comfortable and rather beautiful in the way of rooms that have been lived in and cared for by someone who understood them. Callum had a glass of whiskey. Cressida had a cup of tea. They had sat in the kind of silence that two strangers who have just married occupy, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are deciding what to say first, and in what register, whether to attempt warmth they haven't yet earned, or formality that seems excessive in private, or the particular careful middle register of two intelligent people who have agreed to live together, and are beginning to determine what that means. It was Cressida who broke it. She had not said something charming, designed to ease the moment. She had not said something nervous, as most people in such situations would. She had reached for the bag she'd set beside her chair, a worn leather document bag of the kind that a woman of her circumstances carries when she has important papers and no better vessel for them, and which had been sitting under her chair through the entire wedding breakfast as though she had never considered setting it down. And she had said, with the reasonable directness of someone for whom this was simply the obvious next step, "I thought, if you weren't too tired, we might review the Varn documentation. You said in Edinburgh that you were willing, and I find I sleep better when I've done something useful." He had stared at her for a long moment. "On our wedding night," he said. She looked at him with the gray eyes, gauging whether he was offended or merely surprised. "You said you were curious about the case," she said, in the tone of someone pointing out that a previously stated preference remains relevant to the current situation. "And I don't sleep well when I haven't done something I can actually see the result of. I find evenings difficult." She paused. "I'm sorry if you'd rather not, I understand entirely." "No," he said and set down the whiskey glass. "Show me what you have." He told me later that it was the best decision he made in the whole of that year. Not because of what followed between them, or not only because of that, but because of what he saw when she opened that document bag with the easy efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is and why. She had organized it with a precision that he recognized from his own working method, the method of a person who thinks in structure, who finds disorder actively impeding. Each document was dated, numbered, and cross-referenced in her annotation. There were small paper tabs marking the most significant passages. Her notes were in a small, exact hand in the margins and on separate sheets, and they were right. Not impressively right for a woman, not almost right for an amateur, right, full stop, in the way of someone who has been thinking about a single problem for 3 years and has arrived at genuine clarity about it. She spread it across the small table between the chairs, arranging it in the order that made the argument clear, and she explained it to him quietly and precisely, pointing to each document in turn as she went, not performing the explanation but simply giving it. The way someone explains something to a person they believe is capable of following it, without simplifying, without looking up to check whether they have followed, simply assuming that they have. Because they have decided this person is someone who will follow. No one in Callum Bover's adult experience had ever simply assumed that without testing it first. He followed everything, which he could have told her would be the case but didn't, because the pleasure of following was in the following. She had identified the specific mechanism of Varn's manipulation, not merely the outcome but the architecture of it, the precise sequence of moves, each one defensible in isolation, that had produced the final unjust result. She had traced it through 4 separate loan documents, each signed by Gerald Marne in good faith and altered in execution by a mechanism she had identified. A clause in the interest calculation had been amended in the copied instrument that went to Varne's ledger, while the original remained in Gerald's possession unchanged. She had established that there was a witness to the original terms, a solicitor's clerk who had been present at the first signing and had subsequently taken a position in a different firm in Dorset, and who was still alive and presumably in possession of a memory. He tried, Callum paused, following the document chain to an unexpected turn. Did Varne use an intermediary for the instrument alteration? He used a second name in 2 of the instruments, she said. She found the relevant document without looking. Her hand went directly to it and showed him the signature. I don't think it was intended to deceive at the original signing. I think he expected my father simply never to read the amended copy carefully. He was right for 3 years. My father trusts people, she paused briefly. Then I read it. How old were you? She looked up from the document. 20, a small pause. Does it matter? No, he said, and then, after a moment that was quieter than most of the moments in the conversation, you have been carrying this for 3 years. She looked at him, and something passed through her expression, not vulnerability exactly, but a quality of recognition, as though she hadn't expected him to see that particular thing, the weight of it, the 3 years of fighting with inadequate resources against a settled matter that everyone else had agreed was settled. Someone had to, she said. He was quiet. My father couldn't, she said, not as a criticism, but as a fact, stated the way she stated facts. He is not someone who can hold a sustained difficulty without it breaking him, and it was not his fault, truly. Varne chose him because he trusted, and because he didn't read carefully, but neither of those is a crime, and both are things that can be exploited by someone sufficiently without conscience. She looked at the document in her hand for a moment. I didn't want it to break him, so I took it on. I thought someone should understand exactly what had been done. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the night was entirely quiet in the way that Highland nights are quiet, not urban quiet, which is merely reduced noise, but genuine quiet, the kind that has substance. Callum said, I have a solicitor in London who handles matters of this kind. A different order of solicitor from Dunbar, though Dunbar is excellent for what he does. This man's name is Harwell. He has successfully prosecuted 2 cases of fraudulent instrument alteration in the last 5 years. One was a similar mechanism to what you have described. She was very still. Would he take this case? I believe so. With what you have assembled here, yes, and there may be additional instruments obtainable through discovery proceedings that would strengthen it further. He paused. And I should mention that Silas Varne is known to me. She looked up sharply. Not well, he said. We served on a parliamentary committee together 2 years ago. He was representing interests in a land reform question. He struck me as a man who has learned to perform respectability very effectively. His gaze moved to the document on the table. And as a man who is not accustomed to being looked at carefully. The kind of man who assumes that the form of things protects him because the form has always been enough. Yes, she said quietly. That is exactly that. He is about to discover, Callum said, that the form is not sufficient when the substance has been examined by someone with patience and a correct understanding of the instruments. She looked at him across the small table in the firelight, with the document case open between them and the evidence of 3 years' careful work spread across the surface, and he told me afterward that her expression in that moment was the most unguarded thing he had seen in many years. Not gratitude. He said specifically that it was not gratitude, and I believe him entirely, because gratitude is a passive thing, and Callum Bover has never been drawn to passivity. It was something more like the look of someone who has been fighting alone in the dark for a very long time and has just heard another set of footsteps on the same path. The relief of not being solitary in the effort, the surprise of it. They talked until the fire burned low and the candles guttered, and the room grew cold around them. Not only about the Varne case, about other things too, in the way that people who are genuinely interested in ideas cannot help discussing ideas when they find themselves in proximity to another person who is similarly constituted. The nature of the Highland land reform question that had brought Callum and Varne onto the same committee, and what Callum found inadequate in the current proposals. The legal standing of dead instruments under the current statutes, and where she thought the argument was strongest. Then, somehow, She was not sure afterward how they had arrived there, the question of her languages, which he had noticed in Dunbar's initial description, and which he had been curious about. She had French from a governess and Italian from a traveling musician who had lodged with them at Marne Park for a summer, and given lessons in exchange for room and board, and German from a correspondence with a natural philosopher whose work she had encountered in an Edinburgh journal and written to directly. "You wrote to him directly," Callum said. He had not responded to the two previous scholars who had written about his methodology, she said, and I thought perhaps he might respond to someone who had actually attempted to replicate the relevant experiment rather than simply commenting on it from a theoretical position. There was a silence. "Did he respond?" Callum said. "At some length," she said. "We have been corresponding for 2 years. He is rather good company in letters." Another silence of a slightly different quality. "What was the experiment?" Callum said. And they were still talking about it, somewhat to both their surprises, when the last candle burned to its socket, and the fire was cold ash, and the night had gone so far toward morning that it had come around to the far edge of it. She said, when they finally noticed the state of the room and the hour, that she could sleep now. She gathered her documents precisely back into the bag. She stood. She said good night with the same composure she had brought to the whole evening, neither warm beyond what was warranted nor cooler than courtesy required, the composure of someone who has been exactly who they are all evening and sees no reason to be anything else in the departure. She left. Callum sat in the cold drawing room for another hour. He was not, he told me later, thinking about the Varn case. He was thinking about what she had said, someone had to, and about the natural philosopher in Germany, and about the way she had pointed to the documents without looking at him to check whether he was following, and about 3 years of fighting alone in the dark. He was thinking, he said, about whether he had ever met anyone quite like that, and the honest answer he found was no. I will admit that when he told me all of this, sitting in the library 6 months later with the bracelet turning in his fingers, I was more moved than I showed. Because I have known him 30 years, and I have never once, not once, heard him describe a conversation in the kind of detail he used when he described that first night. The specific documents, her annotation, the German correspondence. The quality of her composure, the way the room had grown cold around them and they hadn't noticed. He told it the way a man tells something he has been turning over in his mind for months and has been waiting for the right occasion to set down properly, and the telling itself had the quality of relief. But I am getting ahead of myself. What followed the wedding night was not the rapid unfolding of a love story. It was, characteristically for both of them, something slower and more honest. The first weeks at Duncraig were a careful negotiation. Cressida Bover, she signed herself so from the first day without self-consciousness or particular ceremony. It was simply accurate, and she was a person who accepted accurate things without drama, set about learning the house with the same methodical attention she brought to legal documents. She spent 2 full days with Mrs. Ichterberg walking every room, asking questions about the household accounts, the staff, the suppliers, the seasonal rhythms of the estate, the particular customs of the house that had accumulated over 22 years of Mrs. Ichterberg's tenure, and which Mrs. Ichterberg had assembled into a comprehensive but unwritten mental catalogue that she had never before been asked to share with anyone. Mrs. Ichterberg, who had spent those 22 years being competent in an essentially mistreated vacuum, a great house with no mistress, and a master who was capable of directing the parliamentary affairs of a county, but deeply indifferent to the question of whether the East Wing linen cupboard had been reorganized, spent those 2 days in a state of careful and eventually uncontainable approval that she expressed to me when I visited in November. In the particular measured language of someone who does not throw approval around, and intends to make clear that this is a considered position. She asked me about the linen accounts, Mrs. Ichterberg said. Not the summary, she wanted to see the actual ledgers, the supplier ledgers specifically. She sat with them for an hour. A pause. She found 2 errors that I had been meaning to raise with the previous supplier for 12 months, and had not had the occasion to address because the Duke had no interest in the supplier question and no Duchess to instruct. And I said, "She wrote the letter herself," Mrs. Ichterberg said, with the specific quality of satisfaction of a woman who has met someone operating at her own standard and found it restorative. "That afternoon, correctly, in the appropriate tone, she asked me to look it over and I found nothing to change. Cressida also established, in those first weeks, a working rhythm with the estate management that Callum found simultaneously useful and slightly astonishing, in the way that useful things often astonish people who have managed without them. She did not ask him for guidance on the household, which was hers to manage, and she did not encroach on his affairs, which were his. When she needed him for a signature, for a decision that genuinely fell within his authority rather than hers, for his preference on something that was genuinely a matter of preference rather than a matter of obvious right answer, she asked clearly, without preamble or excessive context, stated the question, and then acted on the answer without requiring elaboration or reassurance or the performance of enthusiasm about the outcome. He told me, when I arrived at Duncraig in October, that she had reorganized the library cataloging system. He said it the way another man might have said she had rearranged his soul, and I cannot fully explain why it had that quality except that I know him and I know the library, and I know what it means to him that she had understood on her own, which things were his and which were the house's, and had asked about the one that required asking. She found 14 volumes misfiled, he said. Devastating, I said. It took her 4 days. She did it in the evenings after supper. He paused, turned the whiskey glass. She asked first. Of course she did. She said, he stopped, looked at the fire. She said she found it difficult to think clearly when things were in disorder, and she realized it was my library, and she would leave it exactly as it was if I preferred. But if I didn't mind, she thought she could make it considerably more useful to both of us. And you said? I said she should do as she liked. Another pause, longer than the first. She thanked me and started the next evening. What were you doing, I said, while she reorganized? He looked at me with an expression that I recognized as the Callum Bover equivalent of a man caught doing something he is not prepared to explain to another person's satisfaction. Reading, he said. In the library. Yes. While she reorganized the library. The catalog was useful, he said. I wanted to observe the system she was developing. Of course, I said. It is a considerably better system, he said. I have no doubt, I said. He gave me the sideways look he uses when he knows I am not going to let something go and is deciding whether to pursue it or simply wait for me to move on. I moved on because I could afford to be patient about it. The Varn matter proceeded on a parallel track to all of this, with Harwell in London reviewing the documentation Cressida had provided and coming back, within 2 weeks, with a response that was, for a solicitor, almost enthusiastic. The witness in Dorset, the solicitor's clerk named Evenden, now in his 50s and employed by a reputable firm in Exeter, was alive and remembered the original terms of the first loan, signing with what Harwell described as gratifying clarity. There were 2 additional instruments Harwell believed could be obtained through discovery proceedings. And the specific alteration of the loan clause, documented as Cressida had documented it with the 2 versions of the instrument in evidence, fell within the definition of fraudulent conveyance under the current statutes. Callum relayed all of this to Cressida over dinner on the evening Harwell's letter arrived. He had simply brought the letter to the table, because that was already their established custom for matters of shared concern. Share the document, read it together, discuss it directly, with none of the elaborate ritual of men making decisions and informing women afterward that the relevant parties would have considered appropriate, and that neither of them had any patience for. She read it twice. Then she set it down carefully on the table, and her hand was not entirely steady, which was Mrs. Ichterberg, who was managing the service with her customary discretion and had not missed a single development of the evening, the only visible crack in her composure in the whole first month of the marriage. He thinks the case is strong, Callum said. Yes, she said. You built it. 3 years of building it. He said it without particular inflection, as a statement of fact, because Callum does not produce compliments in the usual way, but he does state true things. She looked up from the letter. You made it possible to pursue it, she said. Harwell and the weight of the Bover name behind the inquiry and the resource to take it to a proper proceeding. Those are different things, both necessary. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the careful way she had of saying things that mattered, I would not have been able to do this, not without what you have provided. A pause. I want you to know that I understand that. "I know," he said. He picked up his fork and set it down again. "I want you to know that I would have been interested regardless of without the other considerations. The case itself." He looked at her across the table. "You understood something complex, and you pursued it correctly for 3 years with inadequate resources. That is not common." She looked at him for a moment. Then she handed Harwell's letter back and said, "Will you tell me what he needs next?" They sat at that dinner table for 2 hours, with Mrs. Ichterberg removing and replacing dishes with the serene discretion of someone who has learned not to interrupt a conversation that matters. By the time they came back to the present, the food had gone cold, and the fire in the dining room had burned low, and neither of them had particularly noticed. I came to Duncraig in late October, ostensibly for the grouse. In actuality, I was curious, because Callum's letters, which were characteristically spare, and which I had received from him 3 or 4 times a year for 2 decades with remarkable consistency of tone, had begun to contain details that were unlike his usual correspondence. He had mentioned, in a letter about parliamentary affairs, that his wife had found a passage in a Gaelic legal text relevant to the North Valley question that his Edinburgh counsel had apparently overlooked. He had mentioned, in a note about a planned Edinburgh trip, that he had extended the visit by a day because she had wanted to see a specific natural history collection at the university library, and it had seemed unnecessarily inconvenient to arrange separate transport. He had mentioned, in a letter about nothing in particular that he had written simply because he seemed to want to write it, that she made a particular kind of shortbread that his mother used to make, and that Mrs. Ichterberg had never quite managed to replicate, and that he had not eaten since his mother died when he was 26. These were not the letters of a man conducting a practical arrangement with the appropriate detachment. When I arrived at Duncraig that October, I found a house that had changed in some quality I could not immediately name. It had always been a well-maintained house, clean and austere and slightly forbidding in the way of large Highland estates in autumn, where the light goes early and the moor closes in and the hall becomes the only warmth for miles. What it had not previously had was the particular quality of a house with 2 people genuinely living in it, books left open on tables, 2 lamps lit in the library instead of 1, the sound of a pianoforte in the music room that I associated entirely with Duncraig's quiet evenings and had not heard since Callum's mother died. It was Cressida at the pianoforte. I heard her before I saw her, and she played the way she did everything, not for display, not with the elaborate demonstration of accomplishment that young women were trained to perform, but with a quality of genuine concentration and private pleasure that was entirely her own, something she was doing for herself, for the satisfaction of it. She stopped when she heard me in the doorway and turned with the composure I was already beginning to recognize as her natural state, as fundamental to her as the shape of her face. "Lord Aldray," she said. "He said you were coming. I hope the journey was tolerable." "Entirely, thank you," I said. She gathered her music with the tidiness that characterized everything she did. "He's in the North Field," she said. "He said to tell you the grouse are poor this year, and not to expect much." "He always says that," I said. "He has been saying it for 15 years. The grouse have never once been poor." Something shifted in her expression, genuine amusement, quickly contained but not entirely, because she did not perform containment any more than she performed anything else. "Is that so?" she said, and there was a quality in it, the tone of someone who has been finding a person endearing and has just received confirmation that the tendency is well-founded. That told me quite clearly the direction of things. I liked her enormously in that moment. I told Callum so that evening. "Did you?" he said, with the particular non-expression he uses when he is concealing something he does not wish to have pointed at directly. "She seems to suit Duncraig," I said, generously avoiding specificity. "She suits Duncraig very well," he said. He poured whiskey. He handed me a glass. He looked at the fire for a moment. "She asked me last week about the North Valley, the Gaelic history of it. She had been reading about it in the estate records, the old ledgers, not the current ones, the historical documents. Oh, she wanted to know why my mother had cared about it particularly, what it meant to the family." He paused, with the care of someone approaching something he does not discuss often. I told her. I understood, hearing the way he said it, what that meant. His mother had been a woman of deep Highland feeling, and Callum's attachment to the North Valley was the kind of attachment that does not translate well into parliamentary English, and therefore rarely gets discussed in the company of people who might not understand it or might reduce it to sentiment. The fact that Cressida had asked, and that he had told her not the estate history, which he could have given anyone, but the meaning of it, said several things simultaneously. And I said, "She said she understood," he said, "and I think she did." He turned the whiskey glass in his hand. "She said she thought it was right to fight for something that had that kind of meaning. That land belonging to a family for 300 years wasn't merely a property question. It was a question of what a family was and where it came from and what it intended to keep." He looked at me then, directly, with the full attention he brings to things he wants to be honest about. "She is not what I expected," he said. "I waited. I expected competence," he said. "I got that. I expected practicality. I got that. I did not." He paused with the care of a precise man finding the precise word. "I did not expect her to be interesting, not in the way that she is, not in the specific way." "What specific way?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "She thinks about things," he said, "not about social things. About actual things, the nature of the legal question, the history of the land, the argument in the document. She thinks about them seriously, and she arrives at positions that are her own and that are correct, and she doesn't perform the arriving, she has simply arrived. I find that." Another pause longer. "I find it very good to be in proximity to." "Yes," I said. "I had not anticipated it," he said. And then he turned back to the fire, which in Callum's vocabulary means the conversation is concluded, but the thinking will continue. November brought two things. The first real snow of the season, which came down on the moor with the comprehensive intent that Highland snow brings to the business, and the first real difficulty. The difficulty was Silas Varn. Harwell had made inquiries that could not, at a certain stage of the proceedings, be entirely discreet, and Varn, who was indeed not accustomed to being looked at carefully and had not expected to be, had taken notice and responded. He responded not through legal channels, where he would have had to engage with the evidence Cressida had assembled, but through social ones, which was the arena he understood best. A comment at a club in Edinburgh, repeated by two men who found it interesting, which reached Dunbar's clerk within the week. The substance of it was that the new Duchess of Duncraig had brought her father's debts and her family's disgrace to the Bover name, and that the Duke's decision to involve himself in a settled legal matter that had no bearing on his own affairs spoke poorly of his judgment and possibly of his domestic arrangements. This was, as a strategy, a significant miscalculation. Varn had formed his impression of Callum from the committee meetings, where Callum was always restrained, always formal, occasionally dismissive, but never confrontational. He had not had occasion to observe Callum in the mode that I know him in, which is the mode that arises when someone has done something that violates his code. Callum's code is not elaborate, and he does not advertise it. He believes in honesty, in keeping one's word, in not using power to crush those who have less of it. He considers the violation of any of these principles a personal matter. When a man violates them against someone under his protection, and that category had, without ceremony or announcement, expanded to include his wife, Callum becomes the kind of quiet, methodical, implacable opponent who does not shout or threaten or perform outrage for an audience, but who simply does not stop. He wrote a letter to Varn. I saw it before it was sent because he showed it to me with the calm of a man showing a colleague a document he wants a second opinion on, not because he was uncertain of it. It was 3 paragraphs, entirely civil in language, and simultaneously the most precise and the most unanswerable communication I have ever read. It named the specific instruments. It named Evenden, the witness in Dorset, by name and current employment. It named Harwell and the nature of the proceedings being assembled. And it concluded by observing, in language that was courteous and absolutely clear, that fraudulent conveyance of the documented and witnessed variety tended to attract both civil and criminal consequences, and that Callum was in a position to ensure the matter received the full attention of the relevant parties, unless a resolution could be reached that adequately acknowledged the injury done to Gerald Marne and his family. An adequate resolution, it emerged, was entirely achievable when confronted with that particular combination of evidence and resolve. Varn engaged a solicitor. Harwell engaged with that solicitor. Within 6 weeks, a settlement had been reached that included a substantial payment to Gerald Marne, not the restoration of Marne Park, which had changed hands twice since the original acquisition, and could not be recovered without a legal proceeding of a different and longer variety, but a sum sufficient to allow Gerald to live with genuine comfort and dignity for the rest of his life. Varn also signed a document acknowledging errors in the administration of the original loan instruments, which was not, as Harwell noted, the full acknowledgement of what had actually been done, but which was the maximum achievable without the risk and length of a full proceeding, and which was nonetheless something. A thing on paper in his name that said the matter had not been settled as cleanly as he had wished it. Cressida was in the small study when Callum brought her Harwell's summary of the settlement terms. She had been working on the household accounts for the quarter, which she always found quietly satisfying in the way that some people find needlework satisfying, a problem with a correct answer at the end of it, which she would reach if she was careful and thorough, and would know when she had reached it. She put down her pen without hurry and read the letter standing, because she hadn't thought to sit. She read it twice. Then she stood still for a moment with the letter in her hand and her eyes on the page, and she was very quiet. "My father will know today," she said. "Dunbar writes to him this morning," Callum said. She pressed her lips together briefly, the way she did when something was threatening to become too large for the space she had reserved for it. She stopped, pressed her lips together again. Then quietly, "He has blamed himself. He has never said so, but I know that he has. He thinks I gave up 3 years of the normal life of a young woman to fight a battle that was his to fight, and that he failed me by not being able to fight it himself." "Did you tell him otherwise?" "Often," she paused. "He didn't believe me. He has a view of what a father should be, and he measures himself against it and finds himself wanting. A settlement will not change that measurement." She folded the letter with the care she brought to every document. "But it will help. It will allow him to live as himself rather than as the man who lost everything. That matters." She set the letter on the desk. Then she looked at him and said, "Thank you, Callum." It was the first time she had called him by his given name. He told me about it 2 weeks later with the particular quality of a man for whom a small thing has been large. "She thanked me," he said, "by name." "Your name," I said, "Callum." "Yes." I waited. "She doesn't use names carelessly," he said. "Most people use names constantly. It is social habit. It means very little. She uses a name when she intends it to mean something." "And she intended it to mean something," I said. "I believe so," he said very quietly, with the look of a man taking careful stock of something he is not ready to name. December arrived, and with it the Bover cousins. They had heard about the legal proceedings and their outcome. Information travels in Edinburgh with remarkable efficiency among people with interests to protect. And having calculated that the codicil challenge was now considerably more complicated, and that the visit could at least be useful for intelligence-gathering purposes, they arrived at Duncraig in a party of 4, uninvited, on the pretext of a Christmas call. They were 4 men of the particular type that money and ambition produce when combined with insufficient character. Not openly malicious, never quite directly anything, but relentlessly attentive to weakness, relentlessly probing for the gap in the armor that would give them purchase. Their primary strategy, which became apparent within the first hours of their arrival, and which would have been embarrassing in its transparency had they been capable of embarrassment, was to find fault with Cressida. Not directly, they were too practiced for directness, but through a series of small social maneuvers designed to locate and expose inadequacy. Did she know the correct form of address for a Scottish earl? She knew it exactly, applied it correctly, and showed no sign of having been tested. Had she been presented at court? She had not, which was offered as a social observation with an expression of polite surprise, as though the question were innocent. She received it as a fact she had already known about herself and saw no reason to regret. Did she find the Highlands isolating for someone from a southern background? She said, with a pleasantness that gave them absolutely nothing to build on, that she found the Highlands clarifying. Was her father in good health? Yes, she said, and recently more comfortably settled, she added, with a warmth that contained everything and gave away nothing, except to a person who had been paying close attention to the Varn matter and would therefore understand exactly what more comfortably settled meant. I saw Gideon Bover, the eldest cousin, a man whose defining characteristic was a smile engineered to seem like friendliness, and which managed to seem almost exactly like it. Absorb that answer, recalibrate, and decide to try a different angle. The most pointed moment came at dinner on the second evening. The table was well dressed. The wine was the good Duncraig cellar's best offering. Mrs. Ichterberg had managed the service with the flawless professionalism of a woman who had been managing this house through various difficulties for 22 years. Gideon Bover said, in the tone of someone offering a sympathetic observation, "It must have been quite an adjustment, my dear Duchess, going from, well, your previous circumstances to all of this. These great Highland houses can be rather overwhelming, I understand, for those who haven't grown up with them. The expectations, the management, the scale of it all. The observation was designed to accomplish several things simultaneously. To remind the table that Cressida came from reduced circumstances, to imply that those circumstances had been inadequate preparation, and to place her in the position of either defending herself or acknowledging the implied insufficiency." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. I was watching Callum, who had gone still in the particular way he goes still when something has offended him, and he is deciding how much rope to extend before he retrieves it. He was a moment away from speaking. But Cressida spoke first. She said, in exactly the pleasant, conversational tone she had maintained through the entire 2-day visit, the tone of someone who is being impeccably hospitable, and intends to continue being so regardless of the provocation. "I find it helpful that I was always given excellent instruction in household management, Mr. Bover. I have always preferred a house with genuine character to one that is merely impressive. Duncraig is rather fortunately both." She lifted her wine glass, as though sealing a perfectly ordinary exchange. "Have you always spent Christmas in Edinburgh, or is that a recent preference?" "I imagine it is quite festive there." The change of subject was executed with such fluency, the question posed with genuine interest, drawing Gideon's attention toward an answer before he had fully registered that he had been deflected, that it took him a full moment to understand what had happened. By the time he had fully understood it, the conversation had moved on, and the moment was gone, and there was nothing to address. Callum looked at her across the table. I have spent considerable effort since then trying to describe exactly what his expression was in that moment, and I find that I cannot do it precisely. It was not pride, not surprise, not satisfaction. It was something more fundamental. The expression of a man who has seen something that fits a space he hadn't known, was empty, and who is not yet sure what to do with the discovery but is quite certain that it matters. After dinner, when the cousins had retired and Cressida had excused herself with a composure so entirely intact that it constituted, in itself, a kind of final commentary on the evening, Callum remained at the dining table with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. I stayed. I have been staying for 30 years. "She didn't need my help," he said eventually. "No," I said. "She hadn't asked for it." "No. She was," he looked for the word with the care of a man for whom words matter. "She was completely sufficient, Fenwick. In a room that was specifically arranged to find her insufficient." "She is generally sufficient," I said. "It's one of her most consistent qualities." He turned the glass. "I have been thinking," he said, with a careful quality that told me the sentence was going somewhere specific and he was finding the right route, "about what this arrangement would look like, what it ought to look like, if one were to revise its terms." "In what direction?" I said. He looked at me and then away. "I am not certain she would want that," he said. "Have you asked her?" "We agreed on specific terms," he said. "I don't think it would be fair to alter them simply because I find myself—" He stopped. "Because you find yourself what?" I said. He was quiet. "Not what I expected to find," he said at last. I said nothing else that evening. There are moments in a man's life when the most useful thing another man can do is be present without being useful. But when I came down the next morning early, the cousins were leaving after breakfast, and I intended to see them gone with the minimum necessary ceremony. I found Callum and Cressida already in the library. He was at his desk with his parliamentary correspondence. She was at the smaller desk in the window bay with the household ledgers. They were not talking. They were in the same room with the particular quality that I had begun to recognize as something specific to them. Not performed companionship, not the careful proximity of two people making an effort, but the simple ease of two people who are comfortable with each other's presence and don't need it to be narrated. The fire was lit, the room was warm. Outside, the snow was coming down in the long, thorough Highland way. Callum was not, at the moment I observed him from the doorway, reading his correspondence. He was watching her with the expression. I withdrew. There are things you do not need to witness a second time to understand fully. The cousins left. December deepened into the genuine cold of the Highland winter. And something shifted at Duncraig. Not rapidly, not with ceremony or announcement, but in the way that the meaningful things shift when two honest people are in close proximity and paying attention to what is actually happening between them, rather than what they had arranged to happen. He began to leave books for her, without a note, simply set on the corner of her desk in the window bay, with a page marked where he thought she'd find something relevant to whatever they had most recently been discussing. She returned them with her own marks added, which she had not done at first but began doing around the third book. He asked her opinion on a parliamentary reform position he was developing and found himself uncertain about, not on the household, which was hers, and not as a courtesy, but specifically because he wanted to know what she thought. She read the relevant documents he brought her, and offered an analysis that he told me, with the precise quality of attention he brings to things he genuinely respects, was better than the analysis he had received from the man he paid in London to provide it on the same question. She sees the human element, he said. Most political minds either work with principle or with practical effect. She holds both simultaneously and moves between them. Yes, I said. I find it very good, he said, to have someone to think beside. She made the shortbread, which Mrs. Ichterberg taught her from the handwritten card in the kitchen file where his mother had recorded it 30 years before, on a Tuesday afternoon in December when the snow had closed the roads, and the house was occupied with itself, and left it on the library table. He ate it while reading, in the way that people consume things they want without ceremony when there is no one watching who needs to be impressed. And when she came in that evening and found the plate empty, there was a quality in the small silence between them that contained more than empty plates usually manage. I visited Duncraig again in January, for 2 weeks that I had planned as a brief stay, and which extended themselves by the simple mechanism of being somewhere one does not particularly want to leave. The house in January was something I had not seen before, not forbidding, not austere, but settled, in the particular way of a house that has found its rhythm. The fires were lit at the right times. The meals appeared with a quiet competence that spoke of a household running as it should. Mrs. Ichterberg moved through the rooms with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose professional judgment has been vindicated, which is a quality of satisfaction I have always found warming in people who have earned it. The evenings had changed most visibly. Callum and Cressida spent them in the library, as they had apparently done throughout December, but there was by January a quality to their shared evenings that had loosened from the careful courtesy of the first weeks. They argued one evening, genuinely argued, about a point of Highland land law relevant to one of the reform proposals, each of them with documentation and a position they had arrived at independently and were not prepared to abandon without engagement. It was not a quarrel. It was a debate of the particular kind that two people conduct when they respect each other's intelligence and have no patience for the other being wrong. It lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Callum conceded a sub-point, and she conceded the main point, but identified a nuance in the counter-argument that he found more interesting than the original position, and began taking notes on. You should have been a solicitor, he told her at the end of it. I know, she said without self-pity, as a simple fact about the world as constituted. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, well, you are a duchess, which affords rather more practical scope in certain directions. Yes, she said. I am finding that. They looked at each other across the library table, with the notes and the documents between them and the fire warm behind them, and the look contained something that I, sitting in the third chair with my whiskey and my deliberate quality of not being particularly present, recognized as the specific look of two people who have been discovering each other, and have just discovered something they are pleased about. She also, during that January visit, showed me the North Valley on a clear afternoon when Callum was in the estate office with the land agent. She walked with me along the boundary path and named the features of the landscape with the ease of someone who has learned them and found they mean something. The history she had read in the estate records had given her a relationship to the land that was not Callum's, not 300 years of family feeling, but was genuine in its own way, the relationship of someone who has understood a place and chosen it. He told you about his mother, I said, not a question. I had already understood that. Yes, she said, he doesn't do that easily. A pause. I was aware that he was doing something he doesn't do easily when he did it. Were you? He's not a man who performs openness, she said carefully. He either is open or he isn't, and the choice is made quietly and once, and he doesn't go back from it. I find him very. She stopped. I waited. The Highland wind moved across the valley. I find him considerably more than I expected, she said, and left it there, and we walked on to the boundary stone. She put her hand on it when we arrived at it, the old granite marker, 4 feet high, and carved with the Gaelic symbols she had read about in the estate records. She stood with her hand on the stone and looked out at the valley, and her expression was the expression of a person who knows where they are and is glad of it. I came back to Edinburgh in the 2nd week of January and wrote Callum a letter that said, among other things, "She is rather more than not what you expected, isn't she?" He replied in 4 days, "Yes." That was the end of January. The following weeks brought a correspondence that was unusual for him in its frequency and in the particular quality of its content. He wrote about parliamentary affairs, which was normal. He wrote about the Varn settlement's final execution, which Harwell managed in early February without further complication from Varn's solicitor, which was a relief. And he wrote with the offhand quality of a man who is mentioning something incidental, and is not at all sure why he keeps mentioning incidental things about her. The natural philosopher in Germany had written at length on a question she had posed, and she had been drafting her response over 2 evenings, reading passages aloud to Callum as she worked, which he described as surprisingly useful, as it required her to explain the argument to someone who lacked the prior context, and the explanation clarified her own thinking. He had been the sounding board for her scientific correspondence. In a letter that was ostensibly about the reform session, he mentioned that she had asked him to walk the North Valley boundary with her on a clear afternoon, and that they had been out for 3 hours, and had found the old boundary stone. She had found it specifically because she remembered a detail from the estate records he had forgotten. They had stood at it in the February cold while he told her what his grandfather had told him about it. Not a great deal of information, but the kind of thing that a man tells someone when he has decided they belong to the same landscape as he does. I wrote, "You found the boundary stone." He replied, "She found it." I understood. That was February. In March, the matter that had been gathering beneath the surface of the practical arrangement came to a head in a manner so characteristic of both of them that I could not, when they finally told me about it, do anything but appreciate the specific shape of it. Callum had been in Edinburgh for a week of parliamentary affairs, the first extended absence from Duncraig since the wedding, which he would not have identified as significant until he was in Edinburgh, and which became significant approximately 24 hours into his stay. He found, without being able to explain it precisely, that Edinburgh was wrong. Not factually wrong, Edinburgh was exactly as it had always been, his rooms, his clubs, his committees, his colleagues. But it had a quality of thinness, as though something that usually gave the week its texture had been left at Duncraig. He went about his business. He attended the committee sessions. He dined with the men he normally dined with, and found the conversation adequate, and the company perfectly fine, and the whole experience strangely insufficient. He came back a day early. He did not send a letter ahead because he had not, until he was already writing, made the decision. He arrived in the late afternoon to a house that was surprised by him, the stable boy, Mrs. Ichterberg in the hall with a basket of household linens, the kitchen fire that had been banked for the evening. He went directly to the library because that was where she usually was in the late afternoon. She was not there. He found her in the north garden. Not the formal garden, where the paths were kept and the hedges maintained, but the wild garden at the north end, where the walls were low and the moor showed above them, and the wind came off the valley with nothing between it and the person standing at the wall. She was wearing a coat that was adequate for a London October and not adequate for a Highland March, and she was standing at the northern wall looking out at the valley below, and she was crying. He stopped at the gate. He had a moment in which to decide what to do because she had not heard him. The wind was in her face, and his footsteps had been quiet in the wet grass, and that moment contained several things simultaneously. The recognition of what he was seeing, which was a young woman who had been maintaining her composure for many months without faltering, and who had found an unobserved moment to set some of it down. The question of whether to retreat, which would have preserved her privacy but required him to leave, which was a thing he found he did not want to do. And something else, a pull toward her that was simple and clear and not primarily concerned with the question of what was appropriate. He said her name. She turned quickly. The composure reassembled itself in the instant of turning, not entirely, but enough that her voice was steady when she said, "You came back." "I came back early," he said. She looked at him for a moment across the garden. "Why, Edinburgh was not what I had expected," he said, "or rather, it was exactly what it has always been, which was not sufficient." He moved to stand beside her at the wall, looking out at the valley the way she had been looking at it. "What are you thinking about?" She was quiet for a moment. "Myself," she said, "which I try not to do too often. I find it unproductive." "What specifically?" She turned to look at him, and she had that quality, the one that appeared when she was going to say something she meant. "I was thinking about what this is, what we have, what I had thought we had, and what it has become." She looked back at the valley. "I was thinking about the difference between what I agreed to and what I find I want, and not knowing what to do with the gap between them." He was very still. "I made an arrangement," she said, "and I meant it honestly, and I still mean the honesty. But the arrangement it has become something I didn't include in the original terms, and I don't know whether that's simply my own, whether I have simply—" She stopped. She was not, he had noticed, someone who ran out of words, and the running out meant something. She said simply, "I find I am not entirely satisfied with a practical arrangement. And I didn't know what to do with that, so I came out here." He stood beside her at the wall for a long moment. The wind was cold, and the sky was the color of pewter, and the valley stretched away below them. The North Valley that had been in his family for 3 centuries, and that his mother had loved, and that Cressida had read about in estate records in her first weeks at Duncraig. He said, "I came back from Edinburgh early because I found that its absence, your absence, made it seem thin. Not deficient, merely thin, as though something that gives it density had been left behind." She looked at him. "I have been trying," he said, "to be fair. We agreed on terms, and I didn't think it would be right to alter them on the basis of feelings I couldn't promise were permanent or were more than proximity. I did not want to alter the terms in a way that obligated you to something you hadn't agreed to." "You could have asked," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "I could have, he paused. "I was not certain of myself, which is not a state I am accustomed to and not one I have managed particularly well." Something shifted in her expression, not amusement, not quite, but something adjacent to it, the particular quality of warmth that appears in a person's face when they find someone endearing without wanting to say so directly. "I am not certain of myself either," she said. "I find I have very much wanted to be and have not been." He looked at her. "Would you," he started differently, "I would like to renegotiate the terms. If you are willing." She looked at the valley for a moment, the long view she had always been drawn to, and then she turned to him and said, "Yes, I am willing." It was not dramatic. He did not take her in his arms on the moor in the howling wind. He stood beside her at the wall for a while, both of them looking at the valley, until she put her hand on the stone near his, and he put his over it, and they stood like that while the light changed. Then they went inside because it was genuinely cold, and Mrs. Ichterberg was waiting with dinner and an expression of serene and deeply understanding composure. "He told me about all of this in April, the following month, when I came to Duncraig for the spring. He told it factually in order, with the precise attention to detail of a man who has been carrying a story carefully and is relieved to set it down. And then, when he finished, he reached into his coat pocket and produced the silver bracelet, which I had last seen him turning in his fingers in the library in September when I had found him there before the fire was lit, still in his evening clothes the morning after the wedding. He set it on the table between us. The bracelet was plain silver, finely worked, with a small clasp in the style of the previous generation, the kind of thing made for a particular woman rather than produced for a market. It had been worn. You could see it in the surface. "Her mother's," he said. "Lost in the Varn business in the sale of the household effects when Marne Park was liquidated. She had mentioned it only once in passing, the small things that a settlement in cash cannot recover. The objects. I noted it. And I said, I asked Dunbar to look. The estate sale records were in the public registers. The bracelet had been listed in the household effects catalog and purchased at the auction by a dealer in Bristol." He picked it up and set it down again. I had it retrieved. It arrived at Duncraig in the 3rd week of November. Before Christmas, I said. Yes. You had it for 4 months. Yes. You gave it to her in March. The morning after the North Garden, he said. I put it on her desk before she came down. I did not leave a note because, he paused. I thought she would understand without one, and it seemed to me that a note would reduce the thing, make it explicable when it was better left as itself. I looked at him for a moment. She knew, he said. Of course she did, I said. She is very good at understanding things without requiring them to be explained. Yes, he said, she is. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. The fire burned. Outside, the April light was doing what it does in the Highlands in spring, turning everything a quality of gold that does not last, but that, while it is present, makes the whole landscape feel like something a person would be glad to have walked through. I believe I have loved her from the very first hour, he said. From the wedding night with the document case spread between us and the fire going cold and neither of us noticing. I required 6 months to admit it to myself and a further 3 weeks to say it aloud. That is not efficient. No, I said. I found the state of uncertainty, of not being entirely certain of my own interior, entirely novel, he said. I see now that I was not uncertain. I was taking inventory. The uncertainty was a story I told myself because certainty in that direction was, at the time, somewhat alarming. Why alarming? I said. He looked at the fire. Because she had not agreed to that, he said simply. She had agreed to specific terms. She had entered the arrangement with clarity and honesty, and the expectation that I would be equally clear and honest in return. To find that I had developed feelings that exceeded the terms of the arrangement felt like a unilateral revision of something she had a right to know about, like a debt I owed her that I had been accumulating without her knowledge. I considered this for a moment. It was, I thought, the most Callum Bover way of experiencing romantic feeling that I could have imagined, and simultaneously one of the most decent. That is a very honorable way to be in love, I said. It was a very uncomfortable one, he said. He picked up the whiskey glass. She makes the shortbread, he said, which was not a non sequitur, simply a different approach to the same subject. I know, I said. It is exactly right, he said. My mother's recipe, precisely. Mrs. Ichterberg has been making a version of it for 20 years, and it has always been slightly wrong in a way I could never define. Cressida made it once, and I understood immediately what had always been missing. What was missing? I said. He looked at me with a sideways look. I don't know, he said. Whatever it is that makes the right thing right, she has it. A pause, in the shortbread and in other respects. Callum, I said. Yes, he said. You are happy, I said. He looked at the fire for a moment, and I watched him examine the word with the precision he brought to things he wanted to state correctly. Yes, he said, I am, considerably and specifically so, in a way I would not have known to want before I had it. He looked at me. I did not know one could be this at ease in one's own house. That is because you have spent the last 10 years in this house alone, I said. Yes, he said, I think that is the reason. After dinner that first evening in April, Mrs. Ichterberg's finest effort, with the cellar open and the good silver out, which was not the usual standard for an informal visit but which reflected, I thought, a household in a particular mood. The 3 of us, Callum and Cressida and I, sat by the library fire and talked. Not about the Varn matter, which was closed, not about the parliamentary affairs, which were temporarily adjourned. We talked about the German natural philosopher's most recent letter, which had come that week, and contained a theory about migratory patterns that she found plausible, and that Callum found partly convincing and partly questionable, and the question of which of them was right occupied us for a while, until we agreed that the evidence was insufficient, and the philosopher should be written to for clarification. We talked about Gerald, how he had settled into Edinburgh, how his spirits had lifted, how he had written to say he had found a walking companion, a retired judge who shared his interest in architecture, and that they were making their way through the city's buildings in a systematic way that both of them found very satisfying. She spoke of her father with a warmth that was entirely uncomplicated, and Callum listened to her speak of him with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with the conversation's content and everything to do with her. We talked about the North Valley, and about a dry stone wall on the boundary that needed repointing, and about whether the tenant in the lower farm should be asked to contribute to the cost, or whether the estate should bear it entirely. They had an opinion each, and the opinions were almost the same but not quite, and the discussion of the not quite was interested and equable, and arrived at a conclusion both of them found satisfying. I watched them across the fire. I had been watching Callum for 30 years, and I had learned to read him, and what I read in him that evening was the quiet, settled, specific happiness of a man who has found the life he wanted and knows it. Not a man performing contentment. Callum did not perform, and happiness was not an exception, but a man at ease in the deepest sense. At ease in his own house, at ease in his own skin, at ease with the person sitting across from him. And she was harder to read, always had been, but I had been paying attention since October, and I could see what was there. The composed surface was genuine, not a shield. She had always been composed. But under it, in the evening firelight, in the specific ease of the conversation, and the way she leaned forward when she was engaged and sat back when she was simply content and did not perform either state, under it was a woman who was where she had chosen to be and found it right and was quietly glad of it. When she excused herself for the evening, she said good night to me, and then she looked at Callum for a moment with the particular look that people exchange when they have been talking all day, and the ending of the evening is simply a pause rather than a conclusion. Nothing was said in the look, nothing needed to be. She went out, the door closed. Callum looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "She found the old harness room catalog this week. From 1798, she thought it might be useful for the estate records." "Was it?" I said. "Considerably," he said. "She knew it would be." "She knew it would be," I said. "She often knows," he said. "Things like that, what will be useful and to whom." He paused. "She is very good at understanding what a thing means to a person." "Yes," I said. "I find," he said carefully, "that I am not accustomed to being understood. I had not realized the extent to which I was not accustomed to it until I was." I said nothing. This was one of those moments. "She doesn't make a project of it," he said. "She doesn't study people in order to understand them. She simply pays attention, the way she pays attention to documents, carefully and without agenda." "Yes," I said. "It is," he said, "a very good thing to be on the receiving end of." We sat by the fire for another hour. Then we went to bed, and the next morning I came down to find them in the library as I had come to expect, each at their respective desk. Or rather, each at the other's desk, which I had noticed was how they had arranged themselves by now, she at the large desk that was his and he at the window bay desk that was hers, with the view of the valley behind him and the fire behind her, which was, I thought, the precise inversion of how they had started. I did not comment on this. Some things are better observed in silence. In May, Gerald Marne came to Duncraig for a fortnight, and the whole strange story acquired its proper ending. Or rather, not its ending, since it was plainly not ending but continuing, but the moment at which it became clear what it was going to be. Gerald arrived from Edinburgh by coach on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May, when the moor was at that point in its seasonal change, where the heather hasn't yet come in, but the grass is green and the light is very long, and Duncraig Hall had its shutters open for the first time since autumn. He arrived looking considerably more himself than he had at the wedding, not the man who had been hollowed out by loss and shame and years of careful diminishment, but something approaching the man he had been before all of it, the man who had dined at Marne Park and laughed in his own drawing-room and been, before Varne, genuinely good company. He was warm and rather witty and occasionally impractical in the small domestic ways, leaving things in wrong rooms, forgetting what he had asked for, turning up to meals slightly late with the expression of a man who had been very absorbed in something and isn't quite sure what it was. That Cressida managed with an affectionate patience that was entirely natural and told me, watching her with him, that this was what they had always been to each other. Her steadiness the thing that anchored his pleasanter qualities, his warmth the thing that had taught her what warmth was for. Gerald found Callum, on his second day at Duncraig, in the study after dinner, where I had gone to avoid the particular variety of sociability that requires one to perform interest in topics about which one has no interest, and where I was therefore an inadvertent witness to a conversation I had no right to. Gerald came to the door, saw us both, and said, with the diffidence of a man adjusting to his new situation, "May I?" with a quality that suggested he was still not entirely sure what his welcome here was, though Callum had been unreservedly hospitable from the first hour. "Of course," Callum said, and poured him a glass of the good whiskey, which was also a kind of welcome. Gerald settled into the chair nearest the fire and held the glass and looked at it for a moment, and then said, without looking at either of us directly, "I want to say something. I am aware that I am not entirely entitled to say it, given the degree to which my own failures contributed to the circumstances that made all of this necessary. But I should like to try, if you'll allow." We waited. Callum had a particular quality of waiting, entirely patient, entirely attentive, without the social discomfort that usually accompanies silence in conversations of this register. "She has been carrying something for a very long time," Gerald said. "Not just the legal matter, the everything. The worry for me, and for what our situation meant, and the question of what her future could reasonably look like given all of it. She carried all of that without letting it show, because she did not want to burden me with the weight of her own burden. And I let her." He pressed his lips together briefly. "I let her because it was easier than the alternative, and because she is so capable that it is easy to forget she should not have to be. That she is 23 years old, and should not have needed to be that capable." He looked up then at Callum directly, with the plain honesty of a man saying the thing that has been wanting to be said for months. "She is happy here. I can see it, not in any large thing, but in the small things, the way she moves in this house. The way she is with you, she is herself here, all of herself in a way I have not seen since before Varn." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that it matters, and that I am grateful." Callum was quiet for a moment, with the attentiveness he brought to things that deserved it. Then he said, "She built the case that brought the settlement before I was ever part of it. 3 years, with inadequate resources, and without anyone who could help her pursue it. All I provided was the resource and the name, the mechanism by which what she had already constructed could be used. The gratitude, I think, runs rather in the other direction." Gerald shook his head slightly. "You provided a great deal more than that," he said, quietly and with precision. "Though I understand why you see it as you do." There was a silence. Then Gerald said, "She is her mother's daughter." Her mother thought clearly. It was not fashionable, that kind of clarity, the direct mind, the willingness to see things as they were without arranging them into more comfortable shapes. She learned to be careful with it. And I think Cressida learned to be careful too, from watching, learned to keep the most of herself back, because the world was not always. He stopped, reconsidered. "I think perhaps here she does not need to be as careful. I think you allow her to be as much as she is." "Yes," Callum said, "I do, and she allows me rather the same." Gerald Marne looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has seen something he is very glad of. Then he nodded and drank his whiskey and let the subject rest, because he had said the thing and it had been received, and that was enough. On a warm afternoon toward the end of Gerald's fortnight, the 4 of us walked to the north wall above the hall. Mrs. Ichterberg had packed a basket with the purposeful care that she brought to everything, which is to say the basket was excellent. Gerald walked with her, the 2 of them deep in the Edinburgh architecture question, which had by now expanded from the new town's Georgian stonework to a spirited disagreement about the relative merits of 2 specific streets that I had never visited and felt no particular urgency to adjudicate. Callum and Cressida walked ahead of us on the boundary path. I dropped back deliberately and watched. From a slight distance in the long May light, that specific Highland afternoon light that seems to come from everywhere at once, that makes the old stones golden and the valley below look as though it has been there since before memory and intends to continue. They looked like what they were. Not what they had arranged to be, what they actually were. 2 people walking their own land with the ease of people who belong to it and to each other and know it. He was pointing out a section of the boundary wall that had sunk over the winter. She looked where he pointed and asked something that indicated she had understood the practical consequence, the land drainage question, not merely the aesthetic one, and he turned to answer with the focused engagement he brought to things that mattered to him, which was a category that had expanded considerably since September. She asked a further question. He answered it more fully. She said something that made him look at her with an expression I recognized as the Callum Bover equivalent of being impressed, which he would not have used that word for, but which manifested in the particular quality of his attention. They walked like that all the way up the path. Not arm in arm, not yet, or perhaps not with us behind them, but close, in the way of two people who have stopped having to think about proximity and simply occupy the same space because it is where they both happen to be. At the wall, she stood beside him and looked out at the valley, the view he had grown up looking at and which she had read about in estate records before she had seen it, and which she had, over 8 months, come to understand from both directions. He stood beside her in the way he had stood beside her at the wall in March, when everything between them had changed, and the way he had stood beside her at every wall and window since. They did not say anything for a moment at the wall. They looked at the valley together. It was enough. Gerald and Mrs. Ichterberg arrived with the basket, and the momentum of two people who have resolved something about Edinburgh's cornicing to their mutual satisfaction. The basket was opened. There was tea, which Mrs. Ichterberg poured with impeccable precision, and there was the very good shortbread, which Cressida had made that morning, and which Gerald ate with the specific appreciation of a man who has not had his own family's recipe since his house was sold, and who had not expected to have it again. He did not say any of that. He simply ate it and was quiet for a moment, and then looked at his daughter with an expression that contained everything he didn't say, and she met his eye with the composure that was her baseline but which had in it, for him, a warmth that was entirely without boundary. Gerald turned to the middle distance. "I am quite certain," he said, "that formation of stones is a constructed cairn, possibly Pictish, though I should need the volume the judge lent me to be certain." "We can investigate it next time," Cressida said. "Next time," Gerald said with a quality of pleasure at the words. "Yes." "Quite right." I stood near Callum while Gerald and Cressida were engaged in the cairn question, which she was approaching with the empirical rigor she brought to everything, and which Gerald was approaching with the enthusiasm of a man who very much wants it to be a Pictish cairn. Mrs. Ichterberg was refilling the tea things with her usual economy of motion. Callum was watching Cressida. He was watching her the way he had been watching her since December, with the specific and quiet attention of a man for whom paying attention is a form of care. She was turned toward her father, listening, asking the right questions to keep him talking, with the easy competence of a person who loves someone and has long since learned how to let that love be useful. "Well," I said quietly. "Well," he said. 8 months, I said. "Yes," he said. "You have managed it rather better than you planned." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I plan for practicality and mutual respect and the management of a great house. I have those." He watched his wife. "I have also considerably more than I planned for, which I did not expect and for which I am," he paused, finding the right word, as he always did, "grateful, in a way that I didn't know I would be or how to be until I was." "She has been good for you," I said. "She has been very good for me," he said. "And I have given it a good deal of thought, I intend to be equally good for her over a much longer period." "I believe you will be," I said. He nodded. Not as a performance, as an acknowledgement of something he intended to hold to. Across the wall, Cressida laughed at something her father had said about the cairn, the full, unguarded laugh, the one I had first heard in October, and which had not appeared often enough in the years before Duncraig, from what I could gather. The laugh of a person who has put down a weight they had been carrying for a long time, and found that without it they are capable of this. It changed her face entirely, as it always did, into something completely alive. And she was not, in that moment, the composed and careful Cressida who had arrived at the Dunbar offices with a document bag and 3 conditions. She was simply a young woman laughing at her father on a wall above a Highland valley on a warm afternoon in May, with a life ahead of her that was hers, and that she had made right by sheer force of intelligence and patience and refusal to accept as settled the things that were not right. Callum watched it happen. He had the expression. The same one, the one I had been watching since December. The one I have been trying to describe for the entire length of this account, and which I am going to stop trying to describe, because some expressions belong entirely to the person wearing them and to the person they are for, and to everyone else they are simply what they look like. A man looking at a woman he loves, in a place he loves, knowing both facts and finding them sufficient. The valley stretched away below us in the long Highland afternoon, and the north wall was warm under our hands from the May sun, and Gerald Marne was alive and himself, and planning a return visit to investigate a possibly Pictish cairn, and Mrs. Ichterberg was packing the basket with her usual efficiency and already thinking about supper, and the North Valley that had been in the Bover family for 3 centuries would stay there. and the practical arrangement that had begun with a document bag spread across a table in a cold drawing room on a September night was something else entirely now, and had perhaps been something else from the very first hour. I was there for the first hour. I have been paying attention for 30 years. It is the most useful thing I contribute. That and knowing when not to speak. I managed it for 6 months, in the matter of Callum Bover, and the woman he married for practicality's sake and loved from the very first night. I consider that rather good. They walked back to the hall together in the long afternoon light, the four of us, with the valley behind us and the old house ahead. And I thought about what it means when a thing arranged for one reason becomes, entirely of its own accord, the right thing. When the terms negotiated in good faith become, without revision, the best terms of all. Not because the arrangement was wisdom, though it was not entirely without it, but because two honest people in close proximity, paying attention to what is actually happening between them, will often arrive somewhere better than they planned. The hall door opened. Mrs. Ichterberg's supper was waiting. The drawing-room windows stood open to the more air. And Callum Bover, the most feared duke in 3 counties, the most indifferent man in the London marriage market, the man who had required a wife and married one and taken 6 months to understand what he had done, held the door for his duchess, and she walked through it, and the house received them both, as it had been receiving them all winter and would go on receiving them, as it was built to do, for a very long time.